The next figure we're going to talk about is one that is definitely more well-known, but, we're going to talk about some of the more well-known figures as well, because, let's be honest, a well-known figure within the history of Lutheranism is still pretty unknown, other than Martin Luther. And that is C.F.W. Walther. So C.F.W. Walther is a very large figure within the Lutheran Church in general, but especially within the American Lutheran Church. And he's one that had a very prolific career, one who's had extensive sermons published, had a lot of very popular lectures, and one who was involved in quite a bit of controversy at various points in his life. So Walther's one who you will see referenced by absolutely everyone. You don't have to be in the Synodical Conference to reference Walther. Everyone is grappling with his ideas. And so he has sometimes been called the American Luther, and I think that you could say that in more ways than one. And in one sense, he's like the American Luther in that he has this robust understanding of law and gospel and this passion for defending the Word of God. But he also is a little bit like Luther in his mentality, in the way that he interacts with his opponents, in the way that he is a little bombastic at times. He's got that same kind of attitude that Luther does. So he's not the gentle kind of Melanchthon type. If you look at his wording in some of these debates that he does have, he definitely draws on Luther quite a bit in the way that he responds to people. So Walther was a little earlier than most of the people we've been talking about. His dates are 1811 to 1887. So he is active in ministry in the mid 19th century, whereas a lot of the people we've been talking about is kind of more toward the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And Walther himself, predates them, so he doesn't live until he doesn't make it in his life to the next century, the 20th century. So Walther is known, there's more written about him than nearly any other figure in American Lutheranism, maybe more than any other figure in American Lutheranism, because he's so important and influential. And he is the major figure of the Synodical Conference. He is the major figure of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. He is the first president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. He is the only, as far as I know, he's the only American Lutheran who has a movie based on his life. You can watch the movie if you want, but it's not good. Just be honest with you. It's pretty bad. But I appreciate the effort nonetheless. And you can learn some about Walther's life if you watch the movie. But it's pretty low budget. The acting is not great. But, I watched it. We did a Sunday school where we watched it and talked about Walther's life. And there's some things to talk about there. Just don't expect something like the Luther movie. Well, which one? Because there are actually a few of them. I mean the Joseph Fiennes, is that how you pronounce his name? Luther movie, which is very well produced, and the Walther movie is not. There's also this very weird kind of like Freudian Luther movie as well about his relationship with his dad. That's very bizarre. What came out in the 70s. Interesting. There's also a Finnish Luther opera, which I do recommend. That was very good. So anyway, but the Walther movie stinks. So you can watch it if you want, but it's not good. But it does show you how, he is someone who's that important that people want you to know who he is, because he's got an interesting life and he's got an important life and he had an important mission, and he is a very important figure and thinker. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about the details of his life. You can find them in many places. There are tons of resources about Walther. There are biographies written of Walther. There are books of essays in commemoration of Walther. You can look in the Issues Etc. archives and find a bunch of programs about Walther. So there are a lot of resources out there, both ones that are free and ones that you can pay for. But and there's also a lot of controversy surrounding C.F.W. Walther. So, but we're kind of giving just a basic introduction. So what I want to do is talk about what are some of the ideas that he had, what's some of the theology that shows up in Walther, and if you want to read him, what is it exactly that you want to read, if you're checking him out. Now Walther is most known, if there's any one book that's used more than any other, it's his book, The Proper Distinction Between Law and Gospel. And that has become the classic text on the subject. And what that text is, it's a series of lectures given to seminary students on law and gospel. And he has a series of theses where he goes through, when law and gospel are not properly divided and when they are properly divided. And so he goes through a list of common errors in confusion of law and gospel that show up both in preaching and pastoral care. Really, a lot of the work has to do with just personal pastoral care. So it's a book that a lot of people use in, a preaching class. It is very valuable to learn because it's about applying the text, right? Law and gospel are really about how you apply the text, and ultimately, how God uses the text, of course, because he's the one at work. But it ultimately is how you apply the text, or how you apply doctrine, how you apply what you're speaking about. And that volume is really an excellent resource for anybody. You don't have to be a pastor to read it. The distinction between law and gospel is helpful for anyone to understand, though it is written to people who are training to be pastors. So that is important to know. There are a few different editions of those lectures as well. Some are more expanded, and you can also get kind of revised short versions of C.F.W. Walthers lectures too, if they seem a little intimidating. In my own journey to Lutheranism, the proper distinction between law and gospel was huge. That was one of the first Lutheran works I read. Apart from Luther, the first thing I read was Luther's Galatians commentary, and then I read Proper Distinction Between Law and Gospel, and then I got more into other Luther writings, and then I eventually read Pieper and Krauth. But that was hugely influential for me in understanding kind of where the Lutheran Church is coming from in one of its key doctrines and key distinctions. And this distinction between law and gospel really is the thing that differentiates the Lutheran tradition from the rest of the Christian world. And that's not to say that there's no understanding of a distinction between law and gospel in any other tradition. It can be there at times, but it's not the same. It's confused. And Walther would point that out, that if you don't have universal grace, for example, within Calvinism, your understanding of law and gospel is going to be changed by that. Calvinism does define these things more in covenantal terms, which are not quite the same, but similar in some ways. So the proper distinction between law and gospel, if you want a book of Walther that you're going to read, you've never read any before, check it out. That's the best place to go. That's like essential Lutheran reading for absolutely everyone who has any interest whatsoever. Okay, even if you're not Lutheran, you just want to know like what we're about, what makes you different, what's the law-gospel distinction, go back and read Walther. Okay, it's much better than a lot of modern takes on a law-gospel distinction. I think it's very different and much better. Okay, so apart from that, Walther wrote a lot of sermons. His sermons are very good, and there's an edition of Walther's works being published by CPH right now. They're really nice hardcover volumes. I've got a few of them, and they're excellent. They're really well put together. Very expensive, though, because they're CPH books and they tend to be expensive. But they are worthwhile. They're very good. You could also get, though, a couple other people have published some Walther sermons. Someone put out a bunch of volumes that you can find. It was just an independent person that translated and put them out. They're much cheaper. They're not going to be... here they are right here. I've got a couple of them here. For example, this is Occasional Sermons and Addresses by C.F.W. Walther, translated by Joel Baisley. And they're like these giant volumes. These are cheaper. If you can still find these, I don't even know if they're still in print because it was a while ago I got these. But you can get them there. We also put out one volume of selected sermons of C.F.W. Walther. And those were sermons that were in the public domain. So we compiled them and put them in a volume as well. So there are a bunch of places where you can check out his sermons. But I think it's really valuable to see Walther's sermons because it gives you an understanding of what he meant in his law-gospel distinction, because I think it's often misused, that text today. And Walther is not at all averse to preaching about good works and the necessity of good works, for example. That shows up all the time in his writing, in his preaching. It also shows you that Walther was very concerned about preaching the text, and he preaches what's in the text. And I think some people have taken the law-gospel distinction, and I did a video on this as well, but some people have kind of taken the law-gospel distinction to say, like, your sermons have to just be law and gospel, and that's what matters in your sermons. Almost as if the text doesn't matter, you just kind of you preach the law, then you preach the gospel, then the sermon's over. Walther doesn't do that. He's distinguishing law and gospel throughout the text that he's preaching, and he applies it as law and gospel, but he's still just preaching what's in the text. So I think it's a helpful corrective to read Walther's own sermons on those issues. So beyond that, Walther is well known for a couple things that end up being really controversial. And they're still controversial today. Okay, church bodies exist because of their disagreements with C.F.W. Walther. So the biggest one of those at the time is probably their disagreements about church government, but that's a little more complex, so I'm not going to get into that. But just know, yes, there's a disagreement about church government, the necessity of ordination, what makes a call, those kind of issues, what makes the church, which really were a result of a particular circumstance that Walther found himself in, as well as the Missouri Synod theologians, where they had a Bishop Martin Stephan who ended up committing adultery and all sorts of other terrible things, and he was their bishop. And then they're like, this guy's immoral, we got to kick him out. And then they're like, but what validity do we have as a church now? We're just a bunch of people that came over with this bishop that now is like deposed. Who are we? Are we church? And there's a long debate that Walther's involved in that leads to that. So there's a unique kind of historical background and circumstance as to why he writes what he does about the church. I'm not totally convinced that he's right, but that's neither here nor there. So you've got, along with the controversies about the church, you have the controversy over predestination, and that's kind of the major one. Okay, so that's what people know him for. That's what people are going to be writing about Walther about for many, many years to come, many decades after his death. And the controversy has to do with certain statements that Walther made in the Synodical Conference conventions, where he talked about God electing us unto faith rather than God electing us in view of faith, or intuitu fidei. That's the Latin phrase. And so for the majority of Lutheran history, theologians had used this phrase, intuitu fidei, in view of faith. Someone like Gerhard uses it. It shows up very early on within Lutheranism. You don't find it in Luther, you don't find it in Chemnitz, but it's not long after that it shows up and basically becomes universal after the Formula of Concord. Now, there's also a lot of, I think, different opinions that can be given that label. So I'm not sure they all mean the same thing by it, but the phrase itself is used a lot. So he says God elects us unto faith. God doesn't elect us in view of faith, or he doesn't elect us based on some faith that we are going to have based on something we've done with our will, whether that's cooperate with God's grace or choose faith or a lack of resistance to God's grace. All of those things put something about conversion in our own hands. So he calls it a form of synergism. Now, when Walther makes these initial comments, he ends up causing a huge blow up. And this is the major issue that is going to end up dividing the Synodical Conference from other confessional Lutherans in the United States. So while there may be agreement on every other issue among, say, somebody like Charles Krauth, this issue of intuitu fidei becomes the issue that divides the Synodical Conference from these other confessional Lutherans. And like I said, I think when people use the term intuitu fidei, they're all different views. So you can read people that are basically holding to the Arminian perspective who use the term intuitu fidei. And there are other people who use the term intuitu fidei, but really, I'm not sure are really that much different from what Walther's trying to say. I do think it's not a good phrase. I think it's confusing, and definitely lends toward a total misunderstanding. So I don't promote the use of intuitu fidei at all. I think Walther's right about this. But this leads to a bunch of controversy. I'm not quite sure that Walther really handled himself that well in the controversy. He's just very combative, I mean, I think he's right, but he's very combative in the way that he approached things. And when you read some of and you don't know who to believe, but when you read some of the accounts of what happened when decisions were made, the Missouri Synod gives very different accounts than those who were there, who were not part of the Missouri Synod. But I don't know. It depends on who writes history. I don't know. But whatever you feel about how he acted, that was his view. I agree with his view, as I've talked about this so many times. So he also the elected unto faith view. So that becomes controversial. Now I think Pieper comes along and I think is much better than Walther in his defining. He ends up writing a little book on the issue called Conversion and Election, a Plea for United Lutheranism in America, where he tries to say, all right, let's set down the issues, let's discuss it. Here is what we mean. Here is what we're teaching. Pieper is much clearer. There's some statements of Walther that are very uncareful, and I think Walther later in life even says that about some of his earlier works, that he's accused of being Calvinistic, and while he's not, there are some statements that kind of sound like it. And Pieper's a lot more careful, and it's really just an issue of wording. Okay, I don't think it's really what he means, but it's how you word things, because that is important in theology. And Pieper's much more careful. So if you read Pieper and his dogmatics, his section on election, I think it's fantastic. I think it's so balanced and very, very helpful. But Walther is the first one to really bring up this controversy, and he does it kind of unintentionally. But then the controversy blows up, and this controversy lasts long past his death. The other issue that ends up being debated, which is really more of a debate now, even than it was at the time, is the issue of objective justification. Now, C.F.W. Walther formulates this distinction between objective justification and subjective justification. There are a couple of specific sermons. There's like an Easter sermon where he outlines this in detail. But what he says is there is an objective, universal justification that occurs before we even have faith. And that is at Christ's resurrection. So he uses language that there is a universal absolution of the whole world. So in some sense, the world is forgiven at the resurrection of Jesus. And he uses the term justified. So this is an objective reality. Other, people like Kurt Marquardt prefer the term general justification as to a particular, which I think is probably more helpful because it's all very objective. But there's this objective universal justification. And then faith believes in that universal justification that's already occurred, and then receives subjectively the benefits of the objective thing that's already happened. That's the brief of it. And this ended up being, this is a huge controversy right now. A whole church body exists, Eldona, the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America. It exists because of this issue. And there are people that have left, the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod over this teaching of objective justification. That takes us beyond kind of where we're at here. We could talk about the history of that doctrine, how some people have used it in very weird ways. But you can look, I have programs on objective justification too. I do support objective justification. I think there are really bad ways to formulate it though. But there are very good ways to formulate it. And I think if you want to look at someone who's really good at formulating objective justification, I would point you to Kurt Marquardt. I think he's probably the best on this issue. So Walther's kind of known for then four things. If we're going to summarize really what he's known for, one is his distinction between law and gospel. The second is his church government, which we didn't get into because there's just too much to talk about. But you can find info on that other places. The third is then his view of election, and then the fourth is objective justification. Those are kind of the main points in Walther. The one that I personally have an issue with is his view of church and ministry. But I do think he's right when it comes to the other issues. But that's me. You don't have to agree with me. So that's okay. I hope you don't just all agree with whatever I say. I want to be challenged in these things too. So there you go. That's very brief because Walther is such a major figure. But that's just an idea. So you get an idea of who he is, kind of what some of the controversies were, and what his general legacy is in the world of theology.